In the final days of December 2024, something shifted across Iran. What began as scattered complaints about rising prices and a weakening currency transformed into something far more dangerous for the Islamic Republic. By early January 2025, protests had erupted in dozens of cities, from the bustling streets of Tehran to remote towns in the western provinces. The demonstrations were not contained to one region or one demographic. Students, merchants, factory workers, and ordinary citizens filled public squares and side streets, chanting slogans that had not been heard so openly in years. Among them, a phrase echoed with startling frequency: "Death to Khamenei." It was a direct challenge to the Supreme Leader himself, a figure who has ruled Iran with absolute authority for over 3 decades. The protests were not entirely new. Iran has seen waves of unrest before, most recently in 2022, following the death of Mahsa Amini, a young woman who died in police custody after being detained for allegedly wearing her hijab improperly. Those demonstrations were driven largely by demands for women's rights and social freedoms, and they were met with brutal force. Hundreds were killed, thousands arrested, and the movement eventually subsided under the weight of state repression. But the protests that emerged at the end of 2024 were different in nature. They were fueled not by a single tragic event, but by years of economic mismanagement, international sanctions, corruption, and inflation that has rendered the Iranian rial nearly worthless on the global market. By the first week of January 2025, the situation had escalated beyond what many analysts had anticipated. Reports began to surface of violent clashes between demonstrators and security forces in at least 46 cities across the country. In some locations, protesters set fire to government buildings and banks. In others, they blocked highways and chanted anti-regime slogans late into the night. The regime's response was swift and harsh. Riot police, members of the Basij paramilitary militia, and plainclothes agents deployed across urban centers. In smaller towns, where surveillance and control are typically easier to enforce, security forces acted with particular aggression. Witnesses reported the use of live ammunition in several locations, including the cities of Nurabad in Lorestan province and Hamadan in the west. Videos circulated on social media showing crowds scattering as gunfire erupted, and images of bloodied streets began to spread internationally. The government, for its part, acknowledged the unrest, but blamed it on foreign agitators and what it described as organized conspiracies designed to destabilize the nation. State television broadcast footage of arrests and displayed makeshift weapons allegedly confiscated from protesters, including Molotov cocktails and crude firearms. The narrative put forward by Iranian authorities was one of external interference and internal treachery, not legitimate grievances. Yet the grievances were undeniably real. The Iranian economy has been in decline for years, strangled by sanctions imposed by the United States and its allies in response to Iran's nuclear program and regional activities. The value of the rial had plummeted to historic lows by late 2024, making basic goods unaffordable for millions of Iranians. Inflation had soared past 50%, and unemployment, particularly among young people, remained stubbornly high. The cost of food, medicine, and fuel had skyrocketed, and the government's attempts to stabilize the economy through subsidies and price controls had failed to stem the crisis. For many Iranians, the economic collapse was not just a matter of inconvenience, it was a matter of survival. Families struggled to afford bread and meat. Parents watched their children go without adequate health care. Young graduates found themselves with no prospects, no future, and no hope of change within the existing system. It was this desperation, this sense of having nothing left to lose, that drove many into the streets. As one 19-year-old computer science student from Tehran put it in an interview with The Guardian, conducted anonymously for safety reasons, "If they keep killing us even when we don't go out on the streets to protest, then why the hell are we waiting for the right moment?" The protests also carried a political dimension that set them apart from previous uprisings. In addition to economic slogans, demonstrators openly called for the overthrow of the Islamic Republic and the removal of Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei. Some even went further, invoking the memory of the Pahlavi monarchy, which ruled Iran before the 1979 revolution. For the first time in decades, slogans supporting the return of the Pahlavi dynasty began appearing on walls in Tehran and other cities. This was a significant development. The Pahlavi era, particularly the reign of Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, is a deeply divisive topic in Iran. For some, it represents a time of modernization, secularism, and ties to the West. For others, it symbolizes dictatorship, inequality, and foreign domination. The fact that pro-monarchy sentiments were now being expressed openly in public spaces suggested a profound disillusionment with the current system. It indicated that for a growing number of Iranians, any alternative, even a return to a pre-revolutionary model, seemed preferable to the status quo. Iran International, a London-based Persian-language news outlet known for its critical coverage of the Iranian government, reported extensively on the presence of pro-Pahlavi slogans and imagery at protest sites. The outlet noted that such expressions had been rare in previous demonstrations, but were now becoming commonplace. On New Year's Eve, the unrest took a particularly ominous turn. In Tehran, plainclothes police officers and Basij militiamen stormed university dormitories, targeting students they suspected of organizing protests. A 20-year-old university student, speaking anonymously to British journalists, described the scene in chilling detail. The officers burst into rooms without warning, he said, interrogating students, demanding names, and beating those who refused to cooperate. The raids were designed to instill fear, to break the will of young people who had become the face of the protest movement. Many classes were moved online in the aftermath, a tacit acknowledgement by university administrators that campuses had become dangerous. The student who recounted the raid said something that encapsulated the sentiment of many in his generation. Participating in these protests could destroy our future, he told reporters. But we have realized that under this regime we have no future, so why be cowardly and hide now? It was a statement of defiance, but also of resignation. For these young Iranians, the calculus had changed. The risks of protest were no longer weighed against the potential for reform or gradual change. They were weighed against the certainty of a life without opportunity, dignity, or freedom. As the protests continued into the second week of January 2025, the scale of the unrest became impossible to ignore. The United Students, a Telegram channel associated with Iranian student activists, published videos showing crowds of young people chanting, "Death to the dictator," in university courtyards and public squares. Similar footage emerged from cities across the country, including Avaz, Shiraz, and Isfahan. The National Committee of Resistance of Iran, an opposition group based abroad, reported that slogans such as "Death to Khamenei" were being chanted not only in Tehran, but in provinces like Chaharmahal and Bakhshiri and Fars. The geographic spread of the protests was striking. It suggested that this was not a localized eruption of anger, but a nationwide expression of frustration and discontent. The involvement of merchants and shopkeepers added another layer to the movement. In Tehran, a coalition of merchants issued a statement calling for a general strike and further protests. They framed their action as part of what they described as a nationwide movement for freedom, justice, and dignity. The merchants urged the public to join them and vowed to continue until their demands were met. This was significant because merchants, particularly those in Tehran's sprawling bazaars, have historically played a crucial role in Iranian politics. Their support was instrumental in the success of the 1979 revolution, and their opposition to government policies has often signaled broader societal dissatisfaction. The Iranian government's response to the protests was multifaceted. On one hand, security forces cracked down hard on demonstrators, using tear gas, batons, and in some cases live ammunition. Arrests were made by the hundreds, and state media broadcast confessions from individuals accused of inciting violence or working on behalf of foreign powers. On the other hand, officials attempted to downplay the scale and significance of the protests, portraying them as isolated incidents orchestrated by enemies of the state. State television showed footage of pro-government rallies, where crowds waved Iranian flags and chanted slogans in support of the Supreme Leader. These counter-demonstrations were clearly organized and mobilized by the government, but they served a purpose. They allowed the regime to project an image of stability and popular support, even as the streets of major cities told a different story. Yet despite the government's efforts, the protests did not subside. If anything, they appeared to gain momentum as January progressed. Social media played a crucial role in sustaining the movement. Despite internet shutdowns and heavy censorship, Iranians continued to share videos, photos, and updates from protest sites. International news outlets picked up the story, and images of burning government buildings and crowds facing down security forces circulated globally. The world was watching, and for many protesters, that external attention provided a degree of protection, however limited. One of the more striking aspects of the January 2025 protests was the involvement of older Iranians, particularly those who remembered the 1979 revolution and its aftermath. In interviews and social media posts, some older citizens expressed regret over the direction the Islamic Republic had taken. They spoke of broken promises, of a revolution that was supposed to bring justice and equality, but instead delivered corruption and repression. This intergenerational element gave the protests a unique character. It was not just the young rising up against an old order. It was also a reckoning within Iranian society itself, a collective questioning of the choices made decades ago and the path the nation had followed ever since. Among those who voiced support for the protesters was Farah Pahlavi, the widow of Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi and Iran's last empress. Now in her 80s and living in exile, Farah Pahlavi posted a message on Telegram addressed to the Iranian people. "Today I see you growing stronger than ever," she wrote. "I see young people, men and women from all corners of this great land, standing up and speaking with a single voice that can no longer be ignored. Your courage, strength, and resilience fill my heart with pride. You are not alone, and your voice for freedom and justice resonates beyond Iran's borders." Her message was carefully worded, expressing solidarity without explicitly calling for the restoration of the monarchy. Nonetheless, her intervention was significant. It signaled that figures from Iran's pre-revolutionary past were re-emerging into the political conversation, and that the legitimacy of the Islamic Republic was being challenged not just from within, but from historical alternatives once thought buried. Yet for all the passion and courage displayed by the protesters, significant obstacles remained. The opposition movement was fragmented and lacked centralized leadership. Unlike some other uprisings in the region, there was no clear figurehead, no unified political platform, and no organizational structure capable of channeling the energy of the streets into a coherent political force. This made the protests difficult to suppress entirely, but it also made them difficult to sustain or translate into meaningful change. The Iranian government, for its part, had decades of experience in dealing with dissent. It had survived previous waves of unrest, including the Green Movement of 2009 and the protests of 2022. It controlled the military, the intelligence services, the judiciary, and vast patronage networks that tied millions of Iranians to the regime economically. It had access to surveillance technology and was willing to use extreme measures to maintain power. The question many observers were asking by mid-January 2025 was not whether the regime could survive, but at what cost. How many deaths would it take to silence the streets? How much repression would be required to restore order? And could the Islamic Republic, even if it crushed this uprising, ever recover its legitimacy in the eyes of the Iranian people? As the protests dragged on, rumors began to circulate about divisions within the regime itself. Some reports suggested that mid-level members of the Revolutionary Guard and the Basij were uncomfortable with the level of violence being used against civilians. There were whispers of commanders questioning orders, of security personnel refusing to fire on unarmed protesters. These reports were difficult to verify, and the regime maintained a public facade of unity and strength, but the mere existence of such rumors indicated that the foundation of the Islamic Republic, long considered unshakable, was beginning to show cracks. Then, in mid-January, a startling claim emerged in the British press. The Times of London, citing intelligence sources, reported that Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei had prepared a contingency plan to flee Iran if the situation spiraled out of control. According to the report, the 86-year-old leader had arranged for a possible evacuation to Russia, where he would be accompanied by a small inner circle of approximately 20 aides and family members. The plan, the sources claimed, would be activated if Khamenei determined that the military and security forces were no longer loyal, were refusing to carry out orders, or were siding with the protesters. The report was explosive. If true, it suggested that the supreme leader, the man who had ruled Iran with an iron fist since 1989, no longer felt secure in his own country. It implied that the regime was contemplating scenarios once thought unthinkable, including the possibility of collapse. The Iranian government did not respond directly to the Times report, but state media dismissed it as Western propaganda designed to sow confusion and undermine the state. Pro-regime commentators mocked the idea that Khamenei would flee, portraying it as a desperate fantasy concocted by Iran's enemies. Yet the silence from official sources was telling. The regime typically responded quickly and forcefully to reports it deemed false or damaging. The lack of a definitive denial left room for speculation. Was the report entirely fabricated, or was there a kernel of truth buried within it? Intelligence analysts and regional experts debated the claim. Some pointed out that Russia had long been a strategic ally of Iran, and that senior Iranian officials had cultivated close ties with Moscow over the years. It was not inconceivable, they argued, that contingency plans had been discussed at the highest levels. Others were more skeptical, noting that fleeing the country would be an admission of defeat and would likely trigger the very collapse Khamenei sought to avoid. Regardless of the truth behind the report, its publication had an impact. It added to the sense that the regime was under unprecedented pressure, that the protests were not just another episode of unrest, but a genuine crisis threatening the survival of the Islamic Republic. It also emboldened protesters, who seized on the report as evidence that their efforts were having an effect. By the third week of January 2025, the death toll from the protests had begun to mount. Human rights organizations reported that dozens of demonstrators had been killed by security forces, with hundreds more injured. Exact numbers were difficult to confirm, as the government tightly controlled information and independent journalists faced severe restrictions. Iran Human Rights, a Norway-based organization, had documented over 500 deaths during the 2022 protests alone, and there were fears that the current unrest could prove even deadlier. Families of the victims began to speak out, despite the risks. Mothers of slain protesters appeared in videos, holding photos of their children and demanding accountability. These testimonies were powerful and deeply moving, but they also highlighted the brutal reality of challenging the Iranian state. For every protester who took to the streets, there was a family left behind to mourn. The international community watched the events in Iran with a mixture of concern and caution. Western governments issued statements condemning the violence and calling for restraint, but there was little appetite for direct intervention. The memory of past failed efforts to influence Iranian politics loomed large. Sanctions had not brought the regime to its knees, and diplomatic engagement had yielded limited results. The Biden administration, in its final weeks in office, expressed support for the Iranian people's right to peaceful protest, but offered little beyond rhetoric. European leaders echoed similar sentiments. The focus, for many foreign governments, was on managing the potential fallout from instability in Iran, including refugee flows, regional security concerns, and the impact on global energy markets. Inside Iran, the protests continued, though the intensity varied from day to day and city to city. There were moments when it seemed the movement might lose steam, when the sheer weight of state repression would prove too much to overcome. But then new videos would emerge, new slogans would appear on walls, and new crowds would gather, refusing to be silenced. The resilience of the protesters was remarkable, but so too was the resilience of the regime. The Islamic Republic had weathered many storms over the course of its 40-plus-year existence. It had survived a devastating war with Iraq, international isolation, economic crises, and repeated waves of internal dissent. Its leaders had learned how to adapt, how to co-opt, and how to crush opposition when necessary. Whether this time would be different remained an open question. What was clear, however, was that something fundamental had shifted in Iran. A line had been crossed, a threshold breached. The fear that had once kept so many Iranians silent had begun to erode, replaced by anger, desperation, and a willingness to risk everything for the possibility of change. Whether that change would come through revolution, reform, or continued repression was impossible to predict. But as January 2025 unfolded, the streets of Iran bore witness to a nation in turmoil, a people pushed to the brink, and a regime facing the most serious challenge to its authority in decades. As of mid-January 2025, protests continue across Iran with reports of violent clashes in dozens of cities and a rising death toll. while the regime maintains its grip on power through force and the opposition remains fragmented. This script is based on reporting from international news outlets including Iran International, The Guardian, The Times of London, and human rights organizations monitoring the situation.